Hello and welcome back to AI Snacks with Romy and Robbie, an AI literacy podcast and your bite-sized guide to the big ideas shaping the world of AI and robotics. And I'm your host, Anastassia, CEO and founder of AI Edutainment. And today's AI snack is extra crunchy because we're diving deep into the invisible backbone of the internet and discussing the business of data lake platforms that solve the seemingly impossible trade-off. And this is a sub-second analytics at petabyte scale while dramatically reducing storage costs. And just imagine every time you stream a movie, you click on a link or you send a message, you leave behind a tiny data trail, which is called a log file. And in essence, you're leaving millions of them, and businesses are leaving billions of them. And today's guest has spent 3 decades making sure that those logs don't just pile up, but they're actually powering the AI systems of tomorrow. So I am greeting in my studio Tony Falco, and he's the CEO of Hydralix. He understands how to scale distributed systems. So Tony, welcome to my show.
Thank you, Anastassia, for having me.
And I understand that you spent years and years in Akamai, which is a dinosaur of the internet industry. And you could see in practice how sluggish backends crippled growth of companies if those companies were not paying attention to them. And I understand that you were working as well in a consultancy called Silicon Valley Data Science that was acquired by Apple. And actually, Apple is quite famous for its privacy edge and computation on the edge. And this consultancy was one of the crucial stones to build this privacy data architectures at Apple. Am I correct?
You're correct on both.
Fantastic. And now you are working at Hydralix and you're working alongside a former Akamai alum, and this is Marty Kagan. And he himself is another internet dinosaur or pioneer. And you both started when internet was still a teenager, if I can describe this way. And now we are in an era where AI is a kind of a teenager, though the technology is probably, 70, 80 years old, right?
That's right. That's great.
Yeah. So I would like to just ask you if you kind of, transfer yourself into the past, and you were building first websites in the 90s, right?
Yes.
So what was the moment that you realized that internet will take off, everything will change?
Well, I think, first of all, I love the metaphor of getting involved in the internet when it was a teenager because it was moody, unreliable, delivered and liked to have fun. Back then it was a fun place. But it had to grow up. I think the first time I realized this was a big deal was working at a company called Digex, which was one of the early pioneers of managed services. It used to be, somebody would throw, a bunch of Sun servers up and people would be very technical and know exactly how to, set up their websites. And it was like in the bulletin board era. But as bigger brands and Fortune 500 companies wanted to go online, they needed managed services for that. I think working with Anheuser-Busch on the Bud Bowl and realizing that their plan, which they ultimately decided not to follow through with because of the stability of the internet, they were going to promote a Bud Bowl website during the Super Bowl. And so we were working to scramble, and I realized these companies are now really tying their brand experience at the most critical time of the year for marketing to a website. And they didn't trust it all the way. And so the opportunity to go to, they were concerned about the load on the origin website. And within about 6 months, I had the opportunity to join, a handful of people at Akamai where they were trying to solve exactly that problem, which is how to scale websites, how to take the load that would come from all over the world to a single website and spread that out in layers, sort of concentric rings in all the different networks that your request would have to traverse, basically just big shock absorbers around the world for the traffic. And that was clear. I was dealing with brands like Anheuser-Busch and Granger, just really big Fortune companies.
And I mean, So this issue to work on a plumbing pipe instead of a shiny service, which is like, up front of you. And you stayed in internet plumbing ever since. Do you see some similarities from when internet started to take off, when Mark Andreessen democratized websites with a browser, to the moment when, let's say, Gen AI jumped out of the corner, though once again, it's an old technology, and now everyone started using Gen AI.
So, I had an interesting experience along the way because I went from distributed networking, the CDN, content delivery networking, which distributed the delivery of your website across the internet, to a small but I think important database movement called NoSQL, and that was where we were all building There were a lot of companies that were influenced by work that Amazon was doing, and we built these distributed databases that were very fault tolerant, because that was the other Achilles heel. Once you got your load out onto a content delivery network, you still had the database at home that could fall over from traffic. So it was building resilience there. And it was in my experience with both the CDN and the databases, really just, as you said, the engine room or the plumbing of the internet, that I began to appreciate that a lot of the real breakthroughs come from data engineering, where data can go, where it can reside, where it goes at rest. The insights, um, that we're able to draw now from Gen AI couldn't exist if there weren't engineers figuring out ways to marshal that data. Because AI is really data hungry. And if we were using the databases of 20 years ago, I think it would be very difficult to train the models. So, I think the thing that's really struck me, and it was especially at Silicon Valley Data Science when we were working with brands like Nike and Zebra Technologies. The data scientists were running very familiar sorts of like linear regressions and machine learning on things like management of inventory. And we had a bunch of really smart people from Walmart Labs who knew exactly what to run. What was interesting was that they were running it on really big data sets. So suddenly you could run things that used to take, 2 days to run. You could run them in a couple of hours. So fast enough to really make a difference in, say, a new sneaker drop. And so it was the engineering that has to come first that makes more data available, that sets the table for the big sort of insights that you draw from that data. And maybe there's a little bit of an induction current there where maybe, people see how valuable the insights are, and so they work more on the data. Totally believe that. But I've always felt that like the plumbing is, if you need a beautiful fountain, you got to get the plumbing right.
Absolutely. If you need a house, then you need a good basement, which is clean, pristine, and dry, right? I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about the market space you are in? Because, we have a data explosion, and now here are coming all the synthetics. So Gen AI producing its own data in parallel to the existence of the real-time data. So we have foundational models, and then we have open weight models, and companies are using both. So, how can you describe this market space of companies which are working on the data infrastructure? What is happening there? What are major trends? What do you expect, let's say, 2 years from now? So, how do you see it?
So that's, what we see as a company. And I think it's been like this over the whole life of the company, which I've been here for 3 years. I knew the founder. I knew the company earlier, but like working here for 3 years, there's this essential tension. There's this tension between saving data to get insights out of it and the cost of saving data. And everybody says we're spending too much on data. We need to, and that's why you see, and because of the architectures of the previous class or cohort of observability solutions and databases, you could keep data for 7 days. We're talking specifically about CDN data. I want to take one detour. You hit on it at the beginning, but I really want to just take one small footnote, which is CDN data is in particular very hard to work with, because you go to a website and you click on a very heavy, very like an e-commerce site with lots of different products listed, and some promotions and a shopping cart. You can generate 200 log files just from interacting with that page for 1 or 2 seconds. It's in a massive amount of files. And these are all facts about how the customer experience is, how long it took for you to get the images back, which can be predictive of whether you're going to stay and purchase. There's security things that are happening. It's like, all of the facts about your interaction get reduced to a couple hundred log files. And that's not an exaggeration. Every second you're interacting on a website, and you don't know what's important. And so you try to keep it for as long as you can, but then the previous cohort of technologies was really, really expensive to keep it. And so you have retention periods of 7 days to 90 days. And people are always complaining about their Splunk bills and stuff. I mean, Splunk's a wonderful company, gives people great insights, but just really expensive to store the data. So, that tension that we were built to address that tension. And Marty's experience at Sodexis, which is a company he went to after Akamai, was he was spending millions of dollars, more than he was on his staff, to store the data in the cloud. And this was something that was doing real user monitoring on CDNs. So, basically tracking the experience across the globe from the point of view of an end user. How were they experiencing CDNs, not how the CDN was claiming it was delivering the experience. And so he wanted to solve the problem. He and his co-founder wanted to solve the problem of how to make that data less expensive to store and easier to work with. And so they built something. Really, the idea was to reduce costs. But something really interesting happened. Most people, when given the choice of cutting their costs by 90% or saving their data longer, most always choose, like I'd say 99% of the time, choose keeping their data longer. Because really, they want that data. And we had customers like Fox, who we served the Super Bowl for them last year. They just couldn't afford to keep their CDN data. It just was too expensive to keep because there's just enormous volume. So think about that. Fox News, Fox Sports, all these websites, and they weren't keeping their CDN data for very long because it was just too expensive. And think of all of the insights that they were missing. So the trend, even before AI, was I know there's something in that data. My CISO doesn't want to get rid of this data because there's probably some exploit that we've caught that that we've captured in the data, but we don't know about yet. There's something there. There's some value there, but I got to get rid of it because it's costing me $1 million a month. So now people have that data just at a time when having that data is really important because all of a sudden you've got this very data hungry, tool in Gen AI, and exactly at the time when Gen AI is being weaponized against websites. So you really need to know what's happening on your site with much more fidelity than you did before, because there are very clever exploits out there that are themselves using AI to look like normal humans in a way that scripted bots never could. And you have a book behind you on the ocean. And that book, it reminds me of a way that I describe it. CDNs have been around for 26, 27 years. It wasn't until the last 3 years that people were actually storing the data for very long because it was so expensive. The entire story of your website lives in that data. It's like, and nobody's been able to explore it deeply. It's like the Marianas Trench. It's like this really dark area, this massive, dark, vast space beneath the ocean that we know very little about. And so, we're just beginning to send the first submersibles down to explore. And we're finding really interesting things. Partners who are also scraping their partners' websites with these very clever bots, AIs that try very hard to look like humans, but always mess up one or two things. It's a game of spy versus spy. It's a survival of the fittest down there in the dark data, the data that CDNs generate. And it's just waiting to be explored.
I mean, a picture of an iceberg comes to mind, right? So we are seeing only the surface. So, some peak of the iceberg, but what is really heavy and dangerous is underneath. And I mean, this underneath is to be kind of, transformed into products, services, insights. And I see a lot of nascent markets there. which would specialize in cybersecurity, in consumer insights, in marketing, so whatsoever. And of course, cyber criminals will be very quick to utilize it.
They're very, very clever people.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wonder, when I was very naively looking into the data issue, I was really very superficial because I was thinking, okay, dear company, so you have all those silos, you are unifying the data, you are asking questions, you need to actually clean your data before it can be processed and touched by AI. But I have completely disregarded this issue of data logs as a very specific category which could be utilized in the AI age. Are you seeing a lot of competitors emerging going after those data logs? So, what is the stand of the art there?
Well, I mean, definitely there are people starting to solve the economics problems, and the players that were starting to solve the economic challenges were by accident because nobody really saw what was coming. I mean, the AI part of it. There are lots of good companies that are making it even less expensive and more performant to work with these big kind of peculiar log files. And one of the things that makes them very, very hard to deal with in data terms is there's a concept called cardinality, which is like how many instances of a particular how many answers can a field have. You think about a field in a database, you know, um, name, email address, IP address. There are literally billions of combinations for those. If you're a big website and you're serving, maybe 5% of the world uses that website, you probably got several billion IP addresses and many millions, maybe hundreds of millions of email addresses and screen names, and that's all tied back to really interesting kinds of answers you want to get. And those values can change, and you can be coming from, there might be two or three people at your house that are all using the same IP address, and so that means that like one IP address could be tied to 15 different accounts. And so this becomes very difficult data to work with, really expensive to work with. So there are some really smart people trying to solve the problem. But before you can work on AI, when you work in AI, you have to solve these infrastructural problems. So that's already a gate. And the few companies that have come through focused on that um, are are right now all focused on putting those submersibles down into the Marianas Trench. What can we find from that data? Where we think we stand out, and this is just an approach. This certainly a an insight that I got from this work is our ability to tie different data sources together in very close to real time. So during a Super Bowl, you'll have a company like Fox will be using 4 different CDNs. They'll be doing real user monitoring, real user experience on the devices. What are their users seeing? They have an origin website. They also have something called an encoder that is turning the satellite signal into web streams. All of those are happening simultaneously to deliver that experience all around the world. And if you have that data in silos, you can't find patterns. If 2 different CDNs are in a network center in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you're seeing bad user experience from people in the Raleigh area, is it the CDN that's the problem, or is it the network that's the problem? That's an important question to answer. And so I think what's more interesting than just having the files, and that's plenty interesting, is the kind of correlations you can do. Like, just tying together people's shopping, like your revenue. Like, do certain events on the network correlate with low revenue? Like, does it hurt your revenue if something's super slow? Should you switch from one network to another, in close to real time, if latency reaches a certain point? You know, questions that you can only answer when you have multiple data sources together and that are important to answer in real time are, once you start thinking about that, there are a lot of questions you would ask if the technology was available. So I think there's 2 different parts. Like, this is an AI podcast, and I am fully on board with the utility of AI to solve problems for businesses operationally. That always has to be coupled with the real signal. the actual signal. You can build classifiers. You can build one of the things that we're really focused on is intent, analyzing the intent and seeing, a very crude way of describing it. People go to e-commerce sites to shop and eventually buy. There's no economic reason why a bot would actually buy something. So now that's a very simplistic way of characterizing it, but you look for normal intent, and then you look for things that are exhibiting variance from that intent. They're behaving strangely. They park on one URL and just hit it all the time. Path stagnation is what that's called. That is the use of AI is when it's coupled with real-time actual data. So the AI actually is pulling the insights out of that real-time data. Log files have grown, according to Padraig Byrne from Gartner. He's been tracking it since 2009. Log files have grown about 30% year over year. And that was all before agentic actors. So just imagine it's not just people anymore, but it's agents swarming your site. Maybe they're open clause doing some shopping for you or something. Who knows what it is? It's not always bad agents. But the challenges that people face before AI have been multiplied by AI because of the volumes, but now also AI can solve it. It's kind of interesting. I haven't really thought about that too much. But it's you definitely need to, if you're going to sort through all the data that's coming. I think it was Ars Technica said that their web traffic grew like 3,847%. Some vast number. I mean, they made up the significant last couple of digits, but the point is massive growth in data driven a lot, and a lot of it's being driven by crawlers and sometimes quote unquote legitimate systems.
I think we're in a very, very strange world, because so they are technologists, they are solid or less so. There is some infrastructure supporting the technology, so there are people doing stuff. And then we are in a space where we really lack certain governance ideas on how to navigate this borderline between human and artificial. So real humans doing stuff with the help of technologies, and then artificial, how do you call them? So bots, items, agents doing stuff on behalf of humans or on behalf of other AIs. And actually, I was on the board of Dun& Bradstreet, and I was used, like businesses have a DUN number. We do not have a system to identify agents. We do not have system to identify bots. I think the traffic on Twitter is like 40% bots related and not human related. Maybe it's now even more. So my figures are 2 years old. So how do you envision this dilemma? And does it play a role for a business like yours? Or is it just, let's say, an interesting problem you're looking at, but this is for someone else's to solve?
This is right in this is exactly where we need to operate. And it's, again, you set this conversation up really well, because CDNs are the facts. They're the full fidelity set of CDN logs, coupled with your web logs and a few other pieces of your infrastructure, are going to tell you so much about who's hitting your site and what their intention is. And it's that inference of intent that needs to be constantly trained and constantly updated. And as patterns change on websites, one thing that we found is that every website has kind of a different fingerprint. The path. It's like, I liken it to like a rock wall. Rock walls all have the several paths that you can traverse to get to the top in rock wall gyms, but they're very rarely the same. And so, if you think about the way somebody traverses a website, there's some really unique things about it that can be hard to manage. But if you think about it the right way, it could be a very interesting way to weed out these mass crawlers and these mass bots. So, the point being that, like right now, I'm sure you've seen this, and somebody said that there's enough information now that you can use AI to infer identity. Anonymity on the web is definitely under pressure from AI. Well, that same inference power can be used to sort the good actors from the bad. As an aside, I think it would be like for your audience, I think it would be, this is sort of a subtle point, but it's a point that I think is really important. Even within organizations, good and bad have different definitions. Because if you think about the person, the team responsible for the website and the cost of the website, automations can just be a real burden. The CEO of Reddit called it a tax on doing business on the internet. Just serving all this extra traffic. But if you're like the e-commerce or SEO team, you don't want to block the wrong bot. You don't want to block a bot that's here to help your product be discovered. So you have these really essential tensions where good automation and bad automation may be totally different based on your viewpoint in the organization. And that's got to be resolved as well. There isn't just a one answer to should I block this? There's got to be a what's the business cost? And I think increasingly companies are looking not just for analysis, they're looking for what do I do next?
And I'm just thinking, for a young PhD student, a company like yours might be really a treasure to do research because I guess you're capable to really profile businesses in accordance with those hidden ontologies of behavior of who is approaching the business. So it's not like the ontology or, let's say, I'm a pharmacy, but it's an ontology of who is interested in me rather than, let's say, the usual suspects who are requiring my drugs, so my medicine, and kind of, approaching me online or offline. And I am wondering whether there is a lot of IP in this space, and probably IP is to be generated just, going forward.
There's, I hope I don't get too boring with the metaphor, but we need explorers. We need people to go
Yeah,
down into this data that's just been, we're now amassing data that never was there before.
yeah.
There are patterns that we just don't know. And that's where somebody who, I think in this environment, what I've seen is curiosity and drive are like, if you're a PhD student and you've studied, even logic. I mean, there's so many, you don't even have to need to be a PhD student, but if you're a young student and you want to break into this field, it's about learning the tools quickly and then bringing curiosity and drive. Because when you open up one of these LLMs, it says ask. Often they'll be like, ask me a question. Like, that's the mindset you need to go in there. Like, just the keep asking why, keep asking what, keep drilling down, because nobody knows. Nobody knows. This is wide open. It's a wide open area, and any place where people have data that hasn't been. So I'll just stop. Big corpuses of data, whether they've been examined before or not, are where you're going to find massive opportunities to just change the way businesses run. And on the podcast that you had recently, that I think came out a couple of weeks ago, about Stretch and the company that's trying to build the Expedia for grocery
Groceries.
shopping. One of the things that I heard on that was your guest was describing the challenge that really comes down to like a universal product graph. You're going to need to build descriptors for for products that are, and there are a lot of companies working to build universal product graphs or come up with standards. The usual suspects like Shopify, Stripe. There are going to be multiple standards. Being able to mediate those standards, being able to, if I'm a e-commerce company, do I want to have to support all the standards? So you see, like, every time the industry changes, it creates new opportunities to analyze the new data structures. So
And actually, it's a very exciting problems for the future machine-to-machine communication and agent-to-agent, because those agents need to identify themselves And they will be trustful agents and probably not so trustful. And some of them will kind of, penetrate a company and be capable to do things. And others will be held kind of, on an arm length or even further. How do you think about security in your business, and how do you build protective mechanisms? And what do you learn about security, which is kind of frighten you in your very important infrastructure work?
Well, I mean, I think everybody's heard the story of the Claude, no, the Anthropic mythos model, and it was
Yeah, yeah.
just too powerful.
Seen 17 companies breached out of 36 or so, which is an enormous number.
I know. I mean, you know, safety. We have a powerful tool, and we're tool building creatures. And I just, I worry about the wisdom of like humans in general. Are we a wise species or are we not? I know that this has gone from a, sort of a technical podcast to one that's a little bit more like an ethical podcast or even just a,
We are
philosophical,
this,
but
we are discussing literature here and sci-fi.
yeah.
So go ahead, be my
So, I mean,
guest.
it's like, the optimist in me, is focused on like just being part of, you know, being part of something that I think is probably bigger in its implications than the internet that I was very fortunate to be a young person, working on. It's just, sometimes I'll get into this flow state and it'll take a couple of hours and then I'll be just in that state for a couple hours and you know I'll come out of it. I think people that use this, like, I'm super concerned about like confirmation bias. It's really easy to get confirmation bias, because the systems can kind of flatter you and stuff. So, I've been fortunate to work with some really smart people who come from like social science and actual, hard sciences who really try to, really have advised on ways to keep things, sort of neutral and deterministic and not get like kind of taken away from it. But even with that sort of guard up that I have, it's just such a powerful, way to create. So there's that. And then there's kind of this undercurrent of concern. And I'm not even, I think a lot of people were more worried about like the job side of things. I think that anybody who downsizes good employees um, because of AI is, I mean, they should be repurposing those people who know your business to create more value. That's my personal view. I mean, I'll leave it to everybody to run their business the way they want. The real concern is, Prometheus is fire, right? Is it Prometheus? Prometheus holds up the
Yeah,
world.
yeah. Prometheus stole the fire and gave it
Yeah,
to
Prometheus
people.
holds fire. Yeah, Atlas holds up the world. Really, really impressing. That I'm a literature major, and I'm really impressing everybody with this. But the point is, we have this thing emerging, and we don't know, but then we're creative. So at the end of the day, I'm just security becomes something that isn't just about the bytes and the protocols. I think it's moving to the point where can we even conceive of where the weaknesses are?
Yeah,
And the models find weaknesses that we don't even understand. In 2019, I think it was, or 2018, Google did an experiment or did a demo of an early AI that could call and make a reservation at a restaurant and could handle pauses and react, and it seemed very, very human like. And that may seem like a very trivial thing, but you could see how that could upset an industry and have forced industries to change. And that one small demonstration just shows how much of what we depend on to operate in a society is based on trust, is based on social norms, and is based on habits, familiar patterns. And AI is not constrained by any of those things, but it can act
you
like
know,
it is.
in my first Roman Robbie book, so there's a scene where the family is driving in the direction of France, and the dad learns that Romy, the cat, and Robbie, the robot, made a reservation in a French restaurant using the dad's credit card and mimicking his voice. And obviously, there's a whole conversation on how come. So they produced a deep fake, but for good. Without dad's consent, using his credit card. And actually, so they are then referring to the film about Bourdain, so this famous chef and traveler who explored the cuisine of so many nations. I think he committed suicide at the
Yes.
end of his life. And that was the very first movie where the artificial voice, so the deep fake of him was used because he was no longer alive when the film was finalized. And so my two protagonists are using this example to convince that it's actually okay to use his voice and his credit card to make a reservation in a nice French restaurant because the cat is a foodie. So yeah.
I gotta interject here.
Yeah.
It was not wise for that rabbit to go into a French restaurant. I'm just saying.
It's not a rabbit, it's a robot, and it's a cat. And obviously, a
Okay.
cat cares only for food, and Robert
Okay.
the robot is simply a nerd. So he just wants to learn. So and
I'm sorry.
so that's no. It's not a rabbit. It's Robbie the robot and Romy the cat. So those are the major protagonists. And I'm kind of teaching families about AI while using stories in the style of Winnie the Pooh. And then I kind of, explain what is behind those stories in this very podcast. And then I write like Wikipedia style articles and blog about what is really the essence of all those technologies. So,
Oh, neat.
but I use the deepfakes to kind of, make the story slightly juicier. I am kind of, wondering, Tony, you are a computer science major and English literature major. So you did both. And I must admit, cybersecurity is the thing which gives me real chills when it comes to the real risks of AI. Because, if you look into biases is just a property of the historical data we have. So if we start to debias everything, we come to the black founding fathers of the United States. So Google went through this story, I think in June 23, when out of sudden, I don't remember who, Washington or someone else was black. And then we had Black Vikings and something strange. So, due to devising efforts of the team. So I am not concerned about this. If we are paying attention to how those databases were kind of, built and what was going on, this is a real problem, but it's kind of a known problem and it's in the essence of these technologies. But I'm very, very concerned about the cyber. Because cyber criminals, so it's an industry. If cybercrime was a country, it would be number 3 in the world after US and China. And everything which can help to mitigate the issue is helpful. When you talk to your clients, so are you discussing the cyber thing, or is it kind of, thought, okay, so we are buying those products, so we will be fine? Do you have like specific cyber audits with your clients if I'm not asking for any trade secrets? So how do you work with your ecosystem to address the cybersecurity issue?
So obviously compliance standards, SOC 2, those sorts of things are really important to our clients. Data handling, agreements, making sure that we're compliant. So for us, most of the sort of the foundation is just like the best practice you expect if you're handling, if you're a database of record. What companies care about, and I made a short mention of it previously. What people care about now is getting as much of their cyber data into a long-term hot storage so they can query it really quickly, because we're getting it indexed, because a lot of it's in cold storage. And they're becoming less and less interested in give me an alert, and much more interested in tell me what to do, because I don't have the time. Like, you've got this tool here, you understand your data. Tell me what firewall rule to change. Tell me what VLC rule to change. Wrong acronym, but for your edge rules. The point is, they are looking for recommendations that close loops. They don't want more loops open. They want more loops closed, because the threats are happening so fast. The threats are rising, the number of threats, and they take action so quickly. You can't have an hour-long discussion about what you should do. You need to have recommendations ready to go when you find that pattern. And so the discussion we're having is, don't show me, help me, put this fire out. And the point is dawning on them that policies of throwing data away that were driven by economics probably already have had costs. What have they missed? If you start using a system like ours today, you have 90 days worth of data. By the fourth month of using our system, you have more data, you have more history of your business, of your internet usage than you've had before. So that's both good and it's bad. I mean, if especially with very sophisticated attacks are very patient attacks. They will, if they know you're using a system that only allows you to keep your data for 90 days and you have to get rid of it on the 91st day, they'll make their next move on the 91st day. And that way you're never going to be able to see the pattern of how they got in, what they touched. And, it might take, 12 quarters to get the compromise that they want, but they're patient, and that patience becomes more expensive the longer you can keep that data.
Well, which brings me to a thought that we need to completely rethink how we approach strategy, business development, product development in any business. And what you are talking about, those hidden patterns and who is touching my company, who is approaching me, and how, whether it's a person or whether it's a creature of the internet like a bot. I think this information is tremendously valuable, and I have never encountered this strategic insight when I discuss strategy and business development with big and small businesses. And this could be truly, truly revolutionary if you add a couple of very smart data scientists to your strategy team who would talk to people like you. So maybe this is the future. And probably I need to call my a former company, McKinsey, where I spent a couple of years in over 20 years ago. Tony, what would you like to add to today's conversation? And of course, we can chat for like 5 hours, but I try to keep AI snacks short and crispy.
What I've been telling people, especially younger people at the company or that have asked me about what's going on, do not accept the narratives that people are putting on AI right now. Nobody has the answer. If you get on a podcast and you say this is what AI is going to be, you don't know what AI, what LLMs are going to do for business. It's really up to the people who engage in the next several years. It is very early. The opportunities to shape it and to be creative and to define what it is, and it's always going to change. Everything's amorphous. The internet is a million different things. But I would just say, don't take, don't think that all of the big decisions have been made and all of the big opportunities have been seized. There's just so much to define and so much to create. We're just beginning, just beginning.
Thank you for saying that. And this should keep all of us really humble and down to earth. And that concluded another AI snack. And frankly, the big takeaway for me personally is that AI development is not just about smarter models and more powerful models, but it's about the data those models you have to learn from. And if you're throwing away, for example, your log files, you might be throwing away your bright AI future. And if you would like to connect with Tony, I will put all his info on the show notes to this podcast, his LinkedIn profile, obviously the Hydralix website. And you can look for information in the show notes and on my LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, and come back next week for another AI snack. Our community has grown now to 12,000 listeners. So thank you so much for tuning in, for following the show. And I'm very pleased to announce that my recent white paper on responsible AI, which has never copied one single thing from the usual responsible AI white papers, it has been downloaded 1,700 times from my website. Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for tuning in, and I'm going to see you next week.